They called the single mom crazy for buying an abandoned house, but her German Shepherd proved the town wrong. She just wanted a safe place for her son, even if it meant living in a broken cabin the whole town swore was cursed. But on the very first night, the dog wouldn't stop growling at the walls. And what they found hidden inside would change everything. Letters that should have been read 70 years ago. A soldier who was never supposed to come home. And a secret buried so deep, the entire town built its story on a lie. Now, as the truth claws its way out of the shadows, will this family's courage finally heal decades of pain, or will the ghosts of the past tear them apart forever? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Melody Matthews' weathered blue sedan rolled into the small town of Pine Grove. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with determination. In the rearview mirror, she caught glimpses of curtains twitching and faces peering out from shop windows. "Look, Mom!" 8-year-old Axel pressed his nose against the passenger window, pointing at the rustic storefronts with peeling paint and faded signs. "It's like those old-time movies we watch." In the back seat, Ranger, their German Shepherd, whined softly and shifted his weight, his dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Melody reached over to squeeze Axel's hand, grateful for his ability to find wonder in everything. "That's right, sweetie. This is our new home now." As she turned onto Maple Road, the whispers began. A group of women outside the general store stopped their conversation to stare. An elderly man sweeping his porch shook his head slowly. Melody heard fragments of their muttered words drift through her partially open window. "Poor fool. That cursed place. She'll regret it." Melody lifted her chin higher, refusing to let their judgment dim her resolve. The cabin she'd bought, sight unseen, was their chance at a fresh start, no matter what the locals thought. When they reached the end of the gravel road, Melody's breath caught in her throat. There it stood, their new home. The 2-story cabin looked exactly like the online listing photos, yet somehow more imposing in person. Thick green moss crawled up the weather-worn logs, and several window panes were cracked or missing entirely. The wraparound porch sagged in places, its railings warped by years of neglect. "It's perfect." Axel bounced in his seat, his enthusiasm infectious. Ranger's tail thumped against the back seat, picking up on the boy's excitement. Melody parked and took a deep breath. "Remember what we talked about, Axel? This place needs a lot of work, but we'll make it beautiful together." They climbed out of the car, their shoes crunching on fallen leaves. Ranger leaped down and immediately began sniffing the overgrown yard, his tail held high with curiosity. As Melody approached the front steps, keys jingling in her hand, more whispers carried on the breeze. A couple of teenagers on bikes had stopped at the end of the drive, pointing and muttering to each other. Melody squared her shoulders and ignored them. The ancient key stuck in the lock at first, requiring a firm twist before the mechanism groaned and gave way. The door opened with a squeal that made them all jump, hinges protesting years of disuse. A cloud of dust billowed out, dancing in the rays of sunlight that penetrated the gloom. Ranger, usually the first to investigate any new space, suddenly stopped at the threshold. His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared fixedly at a dark corner of the living room. "What's wrong, boy?" Axel asked, hanging back behind his mother. Melody fumbled for her phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Empty except for cobwebs and a few pieces of broken furniture, the corner held nothing obvious to trigger Ranger's reaction. Yet the dog's growl deepened, his hackles rising. "It's okay," Melody said, trying to keep her voice steady for Axel's sake. "He's just nervous about the new place. Let's open some windows and let in some fresh air." She moved through the room, fighting with stuck window frames until she managed to push several open. The late afternoon breeze helped clear away some of the musty smell, but couldn't quite dispel the heavy feeling of age and abandonment that permeated the space. Axel, his initial enthusiasm somewhat dampened by Ranger's behavior, stayed close to Melody as they explored the first floor. "Mom, he whispered. Why did everyone look at us funny in town? Melody paused in her inspection of a water-stained ceiling. Some people don't like change, sweetie. They've probably told stories about this old place for so long. They've forgotten what's real and what isn't. What kind of stories? Nothing important, Melody said firmly. What matters is what we make of this place now. It's going to be our home, and we're going to fill it with new, happy stories. As they continued their exploration, Ranger remained unusually vigilant. Instead of investigating every corner as he typically would in a new place, he stayed close to Axel, his body tense and alert. Every few minutes, his gaze would snap back to that same corner of the living room, though nothing visible explained his fixation. When darkness began to fall, Melody knew they wouldn't have time to clean enough to sleep in any of the bedrooms. She'd come prepared for this, at least. From the car, they brought in sleeping bags, battery-powered lanterns, and some basic supplies. We'll camp out down here tonight, she announced, trying to make it sound like an adventure rather than a necessity. Tomorrow we'll start making this place shine. Axel helped spread out their sleeping bags in the center of the living room, well away from the corner that had spooked Ranger. The dog paced restlessly as they worked, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. When they finally settled down for the night, Ranger positioned himself between their makeshift beds and the boarded-up fireplace wall, his ears pricked forward and alert. "Try to sleep, sweetie," Melody murmured, reaching across to smooth Axel's hair. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." But even as she spoke the encouraging words, she watched Ranger's rigid posture and unwavering stare at the fireplace wall. The dog's behavior stirred something in her gut. Not quite fear, but a nagging sense that perhaps the townspeople's whispers weren't entirely baseless after all. In the growing darkness, the old cabin creaked and settled around them, its age-old secrets still safely hidden behind walls of weathered wood and years of silence. Ranger maintained his vigil, refusing to relax, while mother and son huddled close together in their sleeping bags, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new home. The night deepened like ink spreading across paper, bringing with it a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. Wind whistled through gaps in the old cabin's walls, making the structure creak and groan in protest. Melody lay in her sleeping bag, eyes wide open, studying the shadows cast by their battery-powered lantern. Sleep felt impossible with every new noise demanding her attention. Tick, tick, tick. At first, she tried to dismiss the faint scratching sounds coming from behind the walls. The cabin was old, after all. Old houses made noise. But as the minutes crept by, the scratching became more distinct, more purposeful. It seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the boarded-up fireplace wall. Beside her, Axel stirred restlessly in his sleeping bag. Ranger, who had maintained his alert posture for hours, suddenly rose to his feet. His low growl vibrated through the quiet room, making the hair on the back of Melody's neck stand up. "Mom?" Axel's whisper seemed too loud in the darkness. "Do you hear that?" "I hear it, honey." Melody sat up, reaching for her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Ranger's eyes reflected the light as he stared intently at the wall. The scratching grew louder. Fighting down her own unease, Melody stood and approached the boarded-up wall. The flashlight beam revealed old, gray boards nailed haphazardly across what must have been the fireplace opening. Years of dust and cobwebs coated the surface. She pressed her ear against the boards, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The scratching seemed to move, traveling up and then across, as if something was climbing inside the wall. Small fingers suddenly clutched her arm, making her jump. Axel had crept up beside her, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Maybe," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe the house doesn't want us here, Mom, like those people in town said." The scratching grew more insistent, as if responding to his words. Melody turned to face her son, forcing her lips into what she hoped was a reassuring smile. She crouched down to his eye level, keeping her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "It's just mice, sweetie. Old houses like this are full of them. Once we get settled, we'll call an exterminator to take care of it." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her. The scratching didn't sound quite like any mice she'd ever heard. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like. Ranger's growl deepened, and suddenly he lunged forward. His claws scrabbled against the wooden boards as he began scratching furiously at the wall. The sound echoed through the empty house like thunder. "Ranger, no!" Melody grabbed his collar, pulling him back. The big dog resisted, straining against her grip, his eyes fixed on the wall, with an intensity she'd never seen before. "Stop! You'll hurt yourself!" The German Shepherd reluctantly backed away, but his body remained rigid with tension. He positioned himself between the wall and Axel, as if protecting the boy from whatever lurked behind the boards. Melody ran her flashlight over the spot where Ranger had been scratching. The old wood showed fresh marks from his claws, but otherwise remained solid. The scratching behind the wall had stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind and their rapid breathing. "We'll check it out properly in the morning," Melody said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "When we have proper tools and daylight. For now, let's try to get some sleep." But as she guided Axel back to their sleeping bags, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this house was very wrong. The townspeople's whispers echoed in her mind, along with all the questions she'd dismissed about why this place had been vacant for so long, why no one else had wanted it. Ranger resumed his vigilant position, ears forward, watching the wall. The scratching didn't return, but the silence that followed felt even more oppressive. Melody wrapped an arm around Axel as he snuggled close to her, his small body tense with fear he was trying hard not to show. She lay there in the darkness, one hand on her son and the other resting on Ranger's fur, waiting for dawn. Whatever was behind those boards, whatever secrets this house held, she would face them in the light of day. She had to. They had nowhere else to go. The wind continued to moan around the eaves of the old cabin, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the night. Melody's flashlight cast long shadows across the floor, and though the scratching had ceased, the feeling of being watched remained. Tomorrow, she would investigate properly. Tomorrow, she would find answers. But for now, all she could do was wait and wonder what they had gotten themselves into. Gray morning light filtered through the weathered boards, casting thin stripes across the dusty floor. Melody had barely slept, spending most of the night listening to the house's strange sounds while holding Axel close. Now, with dawn finally breaking, she could properly investigate what lay behind those mysterious boards. She gripped the crowbar tightly, its cold metal heavy in her hands. The tool had been one of the first things she'd packed, knowing the old house would need work, but she hadn't expected to use it quite so soon, or for this purpose. "Stand back, sweetie," Melody called to Axel, who watched from several feet away with wide, curious eyes. Ranger sat alert beside him, ears forward, focused intently on the wall. The first board groaned as she wedged the crowbar beneath it. Melody threw her weight against the tool, and with a sharp crack, the nails pulled free. Dust and splinters rained down as she pried the board loose, letting it fall to the floor with a hollow thud. "Mom, look." Axel pointed at the gap she'd created. Morning light slanted through, illuminating decades of cobwebs. Melody attacked the remaining boards with renewed determination. Each one came away easier than the last, revealing more of what lay behind. The musty smell of long-sealed spaces filled the air, making her nose twitch. When the final board clattered to the floor, they stood before a dark cavity in the wall. It wasn't just the old fireplace opening. Someone had carved out a larger space, creating a hidden compartment. "Shine the flashlight here, Axel," Melody said, reaching carefully into the darkness. Her fingers brushed something solid and metallic. "There's something." She grasped the object and slowly pulled it forward. A large military footlocker emerged from the shadows, its green paint faded and flaking, brass fittings dulled with age. Despite years of hiding, the seal remained intact. "What is it?" Axel whispered, inching closer. Ranger followed, sniffing the air cautiously. "Some kind of old military trunk." Melody brushed away years of dust and cobwebs. Her heart pounded as she examined the rusted latches. "Help me carry it to the table, honey." Together, they lifted the heavy footlocker and set it on the kitchen table. Morning light streamed through the grimy windows, highlighting the military markings stenciled on the lid. Melody worked the latches carefully, not wanting to break them. With a reluctant groan of metal, they finally gave way. She paused, hands resting on the lid, suddenly aware they were about to uncover someone's carefully hidden secrets. "Should we open it?" Axel asked, practically bouncing with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, Melody lifted the lid. The hinges protested but held. Inside, wrapped in an old oilcloth, lay a military rifle. The metal was rusted, the wooden stock cracked with age. Beneath it, they found a carefully folded uniform, the fabric stiff and yellowed. But it was the stack of letters that caught their attention. Dozens of envelopes, tied with faded ribbon, had never been opened. The paper was brittle with age, the addresses written in neat, careful handwriting. Melody gently lifted the top envelope, examining the address. Her breath caught as she read the name. Margaret Kane. Margaret Kane. Axel perked up. "Mom, I heard that name at the diner yesterday, when those ladies were whispering about our house. They said something about old Miss Kane, and how she never got over." He trailed off, suddenly uncertain, as if remembering he might not have been supposed to hear that conversation. "What else did they say, honey?" Melody encouraged, carefully setting the envelope back with the others. "I don't remember exactly. They got quiet when they saw me listening, but they seemed sad about it." Melody stared at the yellowed envelopes, each one containing words that had never reached their intended recipient. Who had hidden them here? And why had they never been delivered? A sharp scratching sound made them both jump. Ranger had moved to the center of the room and was pawing insistently at the floorboards, his nails scraping against the worn wood. "Ranger, stop that!" Melody called, but the dog continued, more determined than ever. He looked up at her with urgent eyes, then back at the floor, as if trying to tell her something. But Melody's attention was drawn back to the footlocker and its contents. Each item seemed to hold a piece of a story. The rifle, the uniform, and most importantly, those undelivered letters. All of them addressed to Margaret Kane, who apparently still lived somewhere in town. The morning light grew stronger, dust motes dancing in the bright beams that now streamed through the window. The footlocker sat open on the table, its long-hidden contents finally exposed to the light of day. Melody couldn't take her eyes off those letters, each envelope a message frozen in time, waiting decades to be read. Behind her, Ranger's paws continued to scratch against the floorboards, his movements growing more insistent with each passing moment. The bell above the diner door chimed as Melody stepped inside. The morning rush had ended, leaving only a few regulars nursing coffee cups at the counter. Conversations died down as she entered, replaced by meaningful glances and whispered words behind raised hands. Melody straightened her shoulders and approached the counter, where a gray-haired waitress was wiping down the surface with practiced moves. Her name tag read Betty. "Coffee?" Betty asked, already reaching for a clean mug. "Yes, please." Melody settled onto a stool, aware of the eyes watching her. "And maybe some local information, if you don't mind." Betty poured the coffee with a steady hand. "About that old cabin you bought? Honey, I hope you didn't spend too much on it. Actually, I'm curious about someone who might have lived there before." "Margaret Kane?" The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped completely. Betty's hand froze mid-pour, coffee nearly overflowing. The mug. Two elderly men at the end of the counter exchanged knowing looks. "Now, that's a name we don't hear much anymore," Betty said quietly, setting down the coffee pot. "Poor Margaret. She still lives out on Maple Street, keeps to herself mostly. Has for years, ever since." "Since what?" Melody prompted gently. An older woman 2 stools down spoke up, her voice thick with remembered tragedy. "Since Henry Kane abandoned her during World War II. Just up and disappeared. He did. Left his young wife all alone, never came back. Some say he found himself another life overseas. Others think." She shook her head. "Well, doesn't matter what others think. Margaret never got over it." "Henry Kane?" Melody's mind raced, connecting pieces. "Was he in the military?" Decorated veteran, one of the men at the counter offered. Served with distinction, they said. Made it all the stranger when he vanished. Margaret got the telegram saying he was coming home, but he never showed up. Broke her heart, it did. Betty leaned forward, lowering her voice. That cabin you bought? That was their place. Margaret couldn't bear to live there after. Well, after. Let it fall to pieces rather than sell it. Don't know why she finally did. Melody sipped her coffee, processing this information. The footlocker, the letters, all addressed to Margaret but never delivered. Why would a decorated veteran abandon his wife? And why hide his belongings in the wall? When she returned home, she found Axel sitting cross-legged beside the footlocker, examining the uniform's patches and medals with careful fingers. "Mom," he said as she entered, his young face serious. "I've been thinking about the letters." "What about them, honey?" "Maybe." Axel bit his lip, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe Mr. Kane didn't abandon anybody. Maybe he hid those letters because he couldn't leave." The simple logic of a child, yet it sent a chill down Melody's spine. Before she could respond, Ranger's urgent barking drew their attention to the living room. The German Shepherd was frantically pawing at the floorboards near the old fireplace. His claws caught the edge of one board, pulling it loose with surprising ease. "Ranger, stop," Melody called, but then she saw what the dog had uncovered. There was a space beneath the loose boards, and something pale gleamed in the shadows. Kneeling beside Ranger, Melody reached into the gap. Her fingers closed around something small and solid. She pulled it out carefully, dust falling away to reveal a child's shoe. It was remarkably well preserved, as if it had been carefully hidden away rather than lost. "Mom," Axel's voice quavered slightly. Did a kid live here once?" Melody turned the tiny shoe over in her hands. It was made of white leather, probably once someone's Sunday best, with delicate stitching along the sides. The sole was barely worn, as if its owner hadn't had much chance to use it. "I don't know, sweetie," she answered honestly. The townspeople didn't mention any children. The discovery cast a strange mood over the rest of the day. Melody tried to focus on unpacking and cleaning, but her mind kept returning to the mysteries piling up around them. The hidden footlocker, the undelivered letters, and now this preserved child's shoe. Each item seemed to hint at a story far different from the town's accepted version. As night fell, she tucked Axel into his sleeping bag. They were still camping out in the living room until proper beds could be delivered. The boy's eyes were heavy with sleep, but he clutched his flashlight close. "Mom?" he mumbled as she kissed his forehead. "Do you think Mr. Kane was a bad person for leaving his wife?" "I don't know, honey. Sometimes things aren't as simple as they seem." She smoothed his hair back. "Try to get some sleep now." Melody was arranging her own bedding when Ranger suddenly stiffened. His ears perked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Before she could grab his collar, he bolted for the front door, which they'd left slightly open to catch the evening breeze. The dog burst out into the darkness, barking furiously at the woods that bordered their property. His deep barks held a note of urgency she'd never heard before. Melody grabbed the battery-powered lantern they'd been using. Her heart pounded as she followed Ranger's barking into the night, the lantern's beam cutting through the darkness like a sword. "Ranger!" she called. "Ranger, come back!" But the German Shepherd continued barking at the tree line, his whole body rigid with attention, as if he'd spotted something in the dense shadows of the forest. The lantern swayed in Melody's grip as she pushed through the tall grass of their overgrown yard. Her shoes were already soaked with dew, and branches from unpruned shrubs caught at her clothes. Ranger's barking grew more intense, drawing her toward the dark wall of trees that marked the edge of their property. "Ranger, what is it?" she called, her voice shaky. The beam of her lantern cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and dense undergrowth. "Come back here, boy." But Ranger held his ground, hackles raised as he stared intently at something in the shadows. Melody lifted the lantern higher, its light finally catching a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. An elderly man stood at the tree line, his clothes hanging in tatters from his thin frame. His white hair was unkempt, and his face was deeply lined with age and hardship. But what struck Melody most were his eyes, clear and sharp despite his disheveled appearance, now brimming with tears as he gazed past her at the cabin. "My home," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The words carried clearly through the still night air, making Melody's skin prickle with goosebumps. Before she could speak, the old man stumbled backward, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. Ranger immediately gave chase, with Melody following as best she could. "Wait!" she called out, struggling to keep up while holding the lantern steady. "Please, stop!" Branches whipped at her face as she pushed through the underbrush. Ranger's barking echoed through the trees, growing fainter as the dog pursued the mysterious figure deeper into the woods. Melody's foot caught on a root, nearly sending her sprawling. By the time she regained her balance, both Ranger and the old man had vanished into the thicket. "Ranger!" she called out, heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the padding of paws returning through the undergrowth. The German shepherd emerged from the darkness, whining softly in frustration at losing his quarry. Melody reached down to scratch behind his ears, trying to still the trembling in her hands. "It's okay, boy. Let's get back inside." They made their way back to the cabin, Melody's mind racing. The old man's words echoed in her thoughts. "My home." Could it be possible? The timeline would fit. If Henry Kane had survived the war, he'd be in his 90s now. But the townsfolk had said he'd abandoned his wife. They spoke of him as if he were dead. Yet the man she'd seen had looked at the cabin with such raw emotion, such longing. Inside, Melody found Axel sitting up in his sleeping bag, clutching his flashlight. "Mom, what happened?" "I heard Ranger barking." She sat down beside him, pulling him close. His small body was warm against her side, helping to ground her racing thoughts. "There was someone outside, honey. An old man." "Was it a ghost?" Axel whispered, his eyes wide in the dim light. Melody smoothed his hair back, considering how to answer. The letters in the footlocker, the hidden shoe, and now this mysterious figure. It all pointed to something far more complex than a simple ghost story. "I don't think so," she said finally. "He seemed very real. But seeing him made me wonder." "Wonder what?" "If maybe Henry Kane never really died. If maybe he's been out there all this time, unable to come home for some reason." Axel snuggled closer. "Is that why he hid the letters? Because he couldn't deliver them?" "Maybe." Melody reached for the footlocker, which still sat near their makeshift beds. She lifted out one of the bundles of letters, handling the yellowed envelopes with care. The handwriting was neat and precise, full of longing for home and love for Margaret. Why would a man who wrote such tender letters simply abandon his wife? Her hands trembled as she returned the letters to the locker. She couldn't shake the image of the old man's eyes, filled with such profound sorrow as he looked at what was once his home. The house creaked and settled around them, its silence now feeling less threatening and more melancholy, as if it too carried the weight of long-buried secrets. Ranger curled up beside them, his watchful gaze fixed on the window, as if expecting their mysterious visitor to return. But the night remained still, leaving Melody with more questions than answers about the true story of Henry Kane and the house nobody wanted. Dawn crept over the horizon with hesitant fingers, painting the sky in shades of pewter and slate. Melody stood at the kitchen window, cradling a cup of coffee while watching wisps of fog curl through the yard where she'd seen the mysterious figure the night before. The morning air held a sharp chill that seemed to seep through the cabin's weathered walls. Axel shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, do I really have to go to school today?" "Yes, honey." Melody managed a smile, though her mind was still haunted by the old man's tearful gaze. "We need to keep things as normal as possible." After a quick breakfast, they climbed into the car, the trunk still holding the footlocker with its cargo of unopened letters. Ranger settled in the back seat beside Axel, his breath fogging the window as he kept watch. The drive to school was quiet, with only the soft patter of drizzle on the windshield. Other parents shot curious glances their way as Melody walked Axel to the entrance. She knew what they must be thinking. There went the foolish woman who'd bought the Kane place, the house nobody wanted. "Have a good day, sweetie," she said, giving Axel a tight hug. I'll pick you up this afternoon. Once Axel disappeared inside, Melody drove through the misty streets to the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. The elderly clerk peered at her over wire-rimmed glasses as she explained her request. Kane, you said? The clerk shuffled through a filing cabinet. Henry Kane? Haven't heard that name in years. Melody waited as the woman pulled out several yellowed folders. I'm trying to learn more about what happened to him during World War II. Ah, yes. The clerk spread the documents on a scratched wooden table. Quite a sad story, that one. He was declared dead in action in 1945. Distinguished Service Record, Silver Star recipient, but they never found his body. Melody's heart quickened as she scanned the official papers. The death declaration was there in black and white, dated December 15th, 1945. But if Henry Kane had died in the war, who was the old man she'd seen last night? What about his family? She asked carefully. Wife and child, if I remember right. The clerk adjusted her glasses. Margaret Kane still lives here. She's at the Pine Grove nursing home now. Never remarried. Poor thing. Melody thanked the clerk and drove across town to Pine Grove, a sprawling one-story building surrounded by well-tended gardens. Inside, the halls smelled of disinfectant and old age. A young nurse directed her to the sunroom, where several residents sat watching television or doing puzzles. Margaret Kane sat alone by a window, her thin hands folded in her lap as she gazed out at the drizzly morning. Despite her age, she sat straight-backed in her chair, her white hair neatly styled. When Melody approached, sharp eyes turned to study her with surprising intensity. Mrs. Kane? Melody kept her voice gentle. I'm Melody Matthews. I recently bought your old house. Margaret's face hardened instantly. That place should have been torn down years ago. Nothing but bad memories there. I found something in the walls. Letters from your husband during the war. The older woman's hands clenched in her lap. Henry Kane was a coward who abandoned his family. I don't want to hear his name. The letters were never opened, Mrs. Kane. They might explain. Explain what? Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. Explain why he never came home? Why he left me to raise our child alone? I waited years for him, checking every day for letters that never came. Then they told me he was dead, but they never found his body. He just vanished. Melody leaned forward. But what if there's more to the story? These letters, I don't want to see them. Margaret turned back to the window, her profile rigid with decades of bitterness. Whatever lies he wrote, whatever excuses he made, it's too late now. He left us, Miss Matthews. That's all I need to know. You had a child, Melody said softly. The house, we found a child's shoe hidden away. For a moment, Margaret's stern facade cracked. My Tommy, he was only 4 when his father disappeared. He grew up watching me check the mailbox every day, hoping. She shook her head sharply. I won't do this. I won't open old wounds. Please leave. Mrs. Kane, I said leave. The old woman's voice shook with emotion. Take your letters and your questions somewhere else. Some mysteries are better left buried. Melody stood slowly, her heart aching for the pain she saw etched in Margaret's face. If you change your mind. But Margaret had already turned away, her shoulders rigid with rejection. Melody walked out of the nursing home, feeling the weight of untold stories pressing down on her. In the parking lot, Ranger waited in the car, his ears perking up as she approached. As she reached for the driver's door, she noticed Ranger had moved to the back window, his nose pressed against the glass as he stared intently at the trunk. The letters were still there, waiting to reveal their secrets. Ranger whined softly, pawing at the window as if trying to tell her something. Melody looked back at the nursing home, thinking of Margaret's bitter words and the mysterious old man in the woods. Somewhere between these unopened letters and decades of pain lay the truth about Henry Kane, and she was determined to find it. The evening settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a chill that seeped through the old walls. Melody stirred a pot of simple chicken soup on their camp stove while Axel set out paper plates and plastic utensils on their makeshift dining table. A cardboard box turned upright. Smells good, Mom, Axel said, his stomach growling. They hadn't had much time for proper meals since moving in. surviving mostly on sandwiches and snacks while they worked on making the cabin livable. Ranger lay near the door, his head on his paws but ears alert. The German Shepherd had been unusually vigilant since their encounter with the mysterious old man in the woods the night before. "Here you go, sweetie." Melody ladled the steaming soup into Axel's bowl, then her own. "Be careful, it's hot." They had just settled into their meal when a knock rattled the front door, making them both jump. Ranger leaped to his feet, not barking but standing rigid, staring at the entrance. "Mom?" Axel whispered, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. Melody rose slowly, her heart pounding. Through the dusty window, she could make out a hunched figure on their porch. The same ragged man from the woods stood there, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. Her first instinct was to call the police, but something in the old man's posture, defeated, desperate, made her hesitate. She approached the door cautiously, Ranger at her side. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please," came a weathered voice. "I mean no harm. I need to come home." Before Melody could respond, the man's legs seemed to give out. He stumbled forward, catching himself against the doorframe. Without thinking, Melody rushed forward to catch him before he fell. "Axel, bring that kitchen chair over here," she called out. The old man was surprisingly light as she helped him inside. His skin felt cold and clammy under her touch. Axel dragged the chair over, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ranger circled them, sniffing the stranger intently but showing no signs of aggression. Once seated, the old man's breathing came in ragged gasps. His face was deeply lined, his white hair wild and unkempt, but his eyes, when they finally met Melody's, were startlingly clear and blue. "I'm Henry Kane," he said quietly. "And this is my home." Or it was, many years ago. Melody felt her breath catch. Even expecting it, hearing him say the name sent a shock through her system. "But you're supposed to be dead?" A bitter smile crossed his weathered face. "That's what they told Margaret, isn't it? But I never abandoned them. Never." His voice cracked on the last word. His eyes roamed the cabin's interior, taking in the boxes, the camping equipment, the partially removed boards from the fireplace. Tears welled up in his eyes. It looked so different, so empty. There used to be curtains there. He pointed with a trembling hand. Blue ones. Margaret sewed them herself. And Tommy's cradle sat in that corner. Melody pulled up another chair, sitting across from him. "Mr. Kane, where have you been all these years?" "Margaret, your wife. She's still alive. She thinks you deserted her." Henry's hands clenched on his walking stick. "I tried to come back. God knows I tried. But after what happened," he trailed off, his gaze turning distant. "What did happen?" Melody asked gently. "The war." He spoke haltingly, as if each word caused him pain. "I was wounded in Germany. Lost my whole unit. When they found me, I couldn't remember anything, not even my own name. Shell shock, they called it. Took months before I started remembering." Axel crept closer, drawn by the story. Henry's eyes softened at the sight of the boy. "You remind me of my Tommy. He was just a little thing when I left. I wrote letters," Henry continued. "So many letters, trying to explain. But by then, I was in a military hospital in England. Later found out none of them ever reached home. And when I finally made it back to America," he swallowed hard, "I learned they'd declared me dead. Margaret had already suffered so much. I couldn't face her. Not like this. Not as a broken man who'd lost years of his life." "So you stayed away," Melody said softly. Henry nodded, shame evident in every line of his face. "I watched from afar. Saw Tommy grow up. Saw Margaret struggle but stay strong. I told myself they were better off without me. But I never stopped writing the letters. Never stopped trying to explain." He gestured toward the fireplace. "I hid them in there, along with my old footlocker. Couldn't bear to throw them away." "The letters we found," Melody said. "They were meant for Margaret?" "Yes, every one of them. But I was too much of a coward to give them to her." His hands trembled as he wiped his eyes. Now I'm old, and I'm tired, and I just wanted to see my home one last time. Axel, who had been listening intently, suddenly moved forward. He disappeared into the other room and returned moments later with their spare blanket, one of the few comforts they'd brought with them. "You can stay here tonight," Axel whispered, holding out the blanket to Henry. The old man stared at the boy in surprise, then slowly reached out to take both the blanket and Axel's small hand in his weathered one. "Thank you, son," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. His face showed a complex mixture of gratitude and haunted regret. Gratitude for this simple kindness, and the weight of decades of similar moments lost with his own son. Ranger patted over and laid his head on Henry's knee, as if giving his own approval to the arrangement. The old man's free hand came to rest on the dog's head, and for a moment, the cabin felt less empty, less haunted by its past. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin's dusty windows as Henry Kane sat at the weathered kitchen table, his trembling fingers hovering over the stack of yellowed envelopes. Each one bore Margaret's name in careful penmanship, the ink faded but still legible after all these years. "I wrote them," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Every single week, I wrote to her, telling her what happened, begging her forgiveness for being gone so long." He picked up one letter, then set it down as if it burned his fingers. "I never stopped writing, even when the memories were fuzzy, even when I wasn't sure who I was anymore." Melody watched him from across the table, a cup of coffee cooling between her hands. There was something in his bearing, a soldier's posture beneath the raggedness, that made her want to believe him. The military hospital in England, they should have records, shouldn't they? Henry nodded slowly. "St. Margaret's Hospital, outside London. I was there for 8 months. Patient number 473. He recited the details with practiced precision, as if he'd held onto them like anchors in a storm. But when I finally made it home, Margaret had moved. The neighbors said she'd received notification of my death. I couldn't bear to shock her by showing up like a ghost. So you watched from afar," Melody said softly, like a coward. Henry's shoulders slumped. I'd lost so much time. My mind wasn't right. How could I explain? How could I ask her to accept a broken man who disappeared for years? He gestured at the letters. So I wrote instead. Kept writing. Thought maybe someday I'd find the courage. A sudden commotion from outside interrupted them. Ranger's urgent barking filled the air, followed by the sound of frantic scratching. Through the window, Melody could see the German shepherd digging furiously at a spot near the old oak tree. "Ranger?" Axel called out, already heading for the door. "What is it, boy?" Melody rose from the table. "We should check on him. He's been acting strange about that spot for days." Henry struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "The oak tree," he murmured. "I remember." They made their way outside, where Ranger's determined digging had already created a sizable hole. The dog paused only long enough to look at them with urgent eyes before resuming his work. "Should we help him?" Axel asked, bouncing on his toes with curiosity. Melody nodded, heading to the shed for a shovel. When she returned, Henry was standing by the hole, his face drawn in concentration. "Before I left," he said slowly, "I buried something here. A box. To keep it safe until I returned." Melody handed Axel a small garden trowel, and together they joined Ranger's excavation. The morning air filled with the sounds of digging and the occasional metallic clang of tools striking something solid. Finally, Ranger's paw scraped against rusted metal. Melody carefully cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing an old ammunition box, its olive drab paint mostly flaked away. "That's it," Henry breathed. His hand shook as he knelt beside the hole, reaching for the box with reverent care. "I never thought I'd see it again." The lid creaked open, revealing a leather-bound book and several military medals nestled in oilcloth. Henry lifted out the book first, a war diary, its pages wavy with age but intact. "I wrote everything down," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Every mission, every battle, every hospital stay. The doctor said it would help with my memory." He touched one of the medals, Distinguished Service Cross. They gave it to me after the action where I was wounded. The same battle they thought killed me. Melody took the diary gently, opening to a random page. The handwriting matched the letters perfectly. The same careful script, the same slight leftward slant. She flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of military operations, hospital stays, and most importantly, dates and locations that could be verified. "This proves everything," she said quietly. "Your service, your injury, the hospital stay, it's all here." She looked up at Henry, understanding dawning. "Someone must have stopped your letters from reaching Margaret. They never even tried to find you when you were in that hospital." Henry's face crumpled. All those years, she thought I abandoned her and Tommy, my own wife and son, thinking I didn't love them enough to come home. They carried the box inside, spreading its contents across the kitchen table. As morning turned to afternoon, Melody and Henry carefully documented everything, building a timeline of his lost years. Axel helped by organizing the medals, asking questions about each one that brought brief smiles to Henry's weathered face. As evening approached, Melody lit the old kerosene lamp she'd bought for emergencies. Its warm light softened the cabin's stark interior as she opened the diary again, this time to read aloud. "December 25th, 1944, she began. Christmas in the field. The boys tried to make it festive with some pine branches and saved chocolate rations. But my thoughts are only of home, of Margaret hanging Tommy's stocking by our little fireplace, of the blue curtains she made catching the morning light. I carry their picture with me always. When this war ends, I'm coming home to them. Nothing in this world could keep me away except death itself. And even then, I'd find a way back to them somehow." Henry sat in the old armchair, silent tears tracking down his cheeks, as the words he'd written so long ago filled the quiet room. Axel, who had been listening intently, slowly moved closer to the old soldier. Without a word, the boy settled against Henry's side, his small hand finding the weathered one that rested on the chair's arm. Henry stiffened for a moment, then gradually relaxed, his free hand coming up to rest gently on Axel's head. The boy's eyes drifted closed as Melody continued reading, his presence offering simple comfort to a man who had gone without family for far too long. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Melody turned another page, her voice steady as she read the words of a soldier's enduring love for the family he lost. Outside, Ranger kept watch from his spot by the door, his alert ears catching every sound of the night, guarding this fragile moment of healing that had been decades in the making. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Melody parked in front of the Millbrook Historical Society. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the weathered ammunition box from her passenger seat. Inside, Henry's diary and medals clinked softly against each other, physical proof of a truth buried for decades. The society occupied an old Victorian house, its brass doorbell echoing through empty rooms. Martha Whitman, the elderly curator, greeted her with raised eyebrows. "Mrs. Matthews, this is unexpected. I have something you need to see," Melody said, following Martha into a study lined with local artifacts. She carefully laid out the diary and medals on a polished oak table. Martha adjusted her reading glasses, leaning forward to examine the Distinguished Service Cross. "Where did you find these?" "In my yard. They belong to Henry Kane." The curator's head snapped up. "Henry Kane? But he didn't abandon his family," Melody finished. "He was wounded, hospitalized. His letters never reached Margaret." Martha's hands shook as she opened the diary. Her eyes widened as she read, occasionally muttering dates and locations. After several minutes, she looked up, face pale. "This changes everything. The dates, the hospital records, it all fits. He was trying to come home." "Can you help verify this officially?" Melody asked. "For Margaret's sake." "Of course." Martha was already reaching for her phone. "I know people at the Veterans Affairs office. We'll need their confirmation, but..." She touched the medals reverently. "These alone are extraordinary proof." Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By lunchtime, Melody noticed the change in people's faces as she walked down Main Street. The usual smirks and whispers were replaced with curious glances and hesitant waves. Outside the diner, Mrs. Peterson, who had once warned her children away from that cursed house, actually smiled. "Is it true?" she asked softly. "About Henry Kane?" Melody nodded. "Everything's being verified now." Inside the diner, conversations hushed as she entered. Tom Baker, who owned the hardware store, approached her table. "Some of us were talking," he said, scratching his gray beard. "We think there should be a town meeting. Let everyone hear the whole story." "Henry's story," Melody corrected gently. Tom nodded. "Henry's story. It's time we all knew the truth." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The town hall was secured for Friday evening. Martha worked tirelessly, collecting official documentation to support Henry's account. Melody spent hours organizing the evidence, practicing how to present it clearly and convincingly. Axel helped by sorting photographs they'd found in the diary, arranging them carefully on display boards. "Do you think Mrs. Kane will come?" he asked, studying a faded picture of a young Henry in uniform. "I hope so," Melody replied. "Martha's going to personally invite her." The night before the meeting, Melody stood in her living room, staring at the wall where they'd first found the footlocker. The boards had been replaced, the surface smoothed and painted. No trace remained of the secret it had held for so long. Axel appeared beside her, slipping his small hand into hers. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Are you scared about tomorrow?" Melody squeezed his hand. "A little. I want everything to go right, for Henry's sake." "What if Mrs. Kane still doesn't believe?" "Then we'll keep trying. Sometimes the truth takes time to sink in." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching shadows dance across the freshly painted wall. Finally, Melody pulled Axel close and whispered, "Tomorrow everything changes for him and for us." The morning sun filtered weakly through the nursing home's Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the institutional green carpet. Melody's heart pounded as she led Henry down the quiet hallway, his weathered hand trembling on her arm. Axel walked beside them, occasionally glancing up at the old soldier with worried eyes. A nurse directed them to the sunroom, where Margaret Kane sat alone in a high-backed chair, staring out at the carefully manicured garden. Even from behind, her posture radiated a rigid pride that years of isolation hadn't diminished. "Mrs. Kane," Melody's voice was gentle. "Someone's here to see you." Margaret turned slowly, her sharp eyes widening as they fell on Henry. The color drained from her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the heating system. "No," Margaret whispered, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "You're dead. They told me you were dead." Henry took a shaky step forward. "Margaret, don't," she snapped, her voice gaining strength. "Don't you dare speak my name after all these years." Melody placed a steadying hand on Henry's shoulder as he swayed slightly. "Mrs. Kane, please, there's something you need to know." "I know everything I need to know," Margaret cut in. Her voice trembled with decades of stored bitterness. "He left us. Left me alone to raise our boy while he ran away to his war. Never came back, never wrote. Let our child grow up believing his father was nothing but a coward." Henry's legs gave way, and Melody helped him into a nearby chair. Tears streamed down his weathered face. "Margaret, please. I wrote every week. I was wounded, lost." "Lies." Margaret's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "Nothing but lies from a man who abandoned his family." "He's telling the truth," Axel burst out, unable to contain himself any longer. The adults turned to stare at the boy, whose face was flushed with emotion. "He never stopped writing. Look at the letters." Melody pulled the carefully preserved bundle from her bag, holding them out. "We found these hidden in the house, Mrs. Kane. Dozens of them, all addressed to you, never delivered." Margaret turned her face away, but not before Melody caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "More lies. Just like the lies they told me about his death. Just like the lies I told Tommy when he asked about his father." "Tommy?" Henry's voice cracked. "Our boy, what happened to him?" The pain that crossed Margaret's face was raw, immediate, as if the wound were fresh. Pneumonia. He was 8 years old. Kept asking for you until the end, wanting his daddy to come home. Her bitter laugh held no humor. I had to watch him die alone, just like I lived alone all these years. Henry doubled over as if physically struck, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Axel, moved by an instinct beyond his years, went to the old man's side and wrapped his small arms around him. Mrs. Kane, Melody tried again. I know you're hurting, but Henry's been hurting too. He was wounded in action, spent months in hospitals. When he finally made it home, he found you gone, the town, believing he'd abandoned you. The shame and grief drove him away. Good. Margaret spat, but her voice wavered. Let him feel what I felt. Melody laid the bundle of letters in Margaret's lap. These are real. Everyone dated. Everyone full of love for you and Tommy. Someone made sure you never got them. Margaret's hands moved involuntarily toward the letters, then jerked away as if burned. I don't want to hear any more. I don't want your evidence or your excuses. 35 years of silence can't be undone with paper and ink. Margaret, please, Henry whispered. I loved you. I loved our boy. I never stopped loving you. Love? Margaret's laugh was hollow. Love would have found a way home. Love wouldn't have let me bury our child alone. The cruel words seemed to drain the last strength from Henry. He tried to stand but stumbled, caught by Melody's quick grip. His face had gone gray, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. We should go, Melody said quietly, seeing how the confrontation had taxed him. Mrs. Kane, when you're ready to hear the truth, we'll be at the house. Margaret didn't respond, her gaze fixed once more on the garden outside. But as they helped Henry to his feet, Melody saw her hand drift to the letters in her lap, fingers brushing the yellowed paper with something like longing. The drive home was silent, except for Henry's labored breathing. By the time they reached the cabin, he could barely walk. Melody and Axel supported him inside, where he collapsed onto Axel's bed, his face ashen. Mom? Axel's voice quavered as she tucked a blanket around Henry's trembling form. Is he going to be okay? Melody pressed her hand to Henry's forehead, feeling the heat of fever there. Her stomach knotted with worry as she watched his chest rise and fall with difficult breaths. Time, she realized with growing dread, was running out for reconciliation. Rest now, she murmured to Henry, but his eyes were already closed, exhaustion and illness pulling him under. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, marking the passage of precious hours they might not have left. The late afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's freshly cleaned windows, casting warm light across the gathered faces. Melody had arranged chairs in a rough circle in the living room, where 24 townsfolk sat shoulder to shoulder. The military footlocker stood open on the coffee table, its contents carefully arranged, the metals gleaming softly, the diary's worn leather cover catching the light. Henry Kane sat in an old armchair by the fireplace, looking frail but dignified in clean clothes borrowed from one of the neighbors. Ranger lay stretched across his feet, the dog's protective presence seeming to give the old soldier strength. Axel perched on the arm of his chair, one small hand resting on Henry's shoulder. Thank you all for coming, Melody began, her voice steady despite her nerves. She held up the diary, its pages dog-eared and yellowed. What I'm about to read isn't just a story, it's the truth about a man this town misunderstood for 35 years. She opened to the first marked page, clearing her throat. April 15th, 1944. Dear Margaret, another week without word from home. The nurses say mail delivery is disrupted, but my heart grows heavier each day. My wounds heal slowly, but the pain of separation from you and Tommy is worse than any physical hurt. As Melody read, the room grew still. She chose passages that painted a vivid picture. Henry's desperate attempts to contact home from various field hospitals, his joy at finally being cleared to return, the devastating moment he found his house empty and his family gone. October 3rd, 1945. She continued, her voice thick with emotion. Found another letter returned today. 13th one. Someone at the post office says Margaret's moved away, believing me dead or worse. The shame of what they must think of me is unbearable. How do I face my neighbors when they look at me like a deserter? The medals mean nothing if my own family believes I abandoned them. Old Mrs. Peterson, who'd been one of the loudest voices against buying the cursed cabin, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. Roberts, the hardware store owner, stared at his hands, his face troubled with remembrance. Melody set down the diary and lifted a small wooden box. These were found buried in the yard. Henry's service medals. The Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Each one earned with blood and courage, then hidden away because he couldn't bear to keep them when his honor was questioned. A murmur ran through the crowd. Tom Wilson, who'd served in Vietnam, stood up to examine the medals. "These are real," he announced, his voice gruff with respect. "No man earns these by being a coward." Henry's hands trembled in his lap. "I never wanted medals," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed room. "I just wanted to come home to my family." Something seemed to break in the collective heart of the gathering. Mrs. Peterson rose shakily to her feet, walked over to Henry, and clasped his hand. "We were wrong," she said simply. "So terribly wrong." The gesture opened a floodgate. One by one, neighbors came forward to shake Henry's hand, pat his shoulder, offer words of apology and support. Ranger wagged his tail, sensing the shift in mood, as Axel beamed at the acceptance washing over his new friend. "The roof needs work before winter," Dave Miller announced, studying the ceiling. "I can get my crew out here next week." "My Martha makes the best chicken soup," Mrs. Roberts chimed in. "I'll bring some by tomorrow." "We've got extra blankets in storage," added Sarah from the general store, "and warm clothes that should fit." Melody watched in amazement as the cabin, so long a symbol of shame and abandonment, transformed into a center of community purpose. The very neighbors who'd whispered about curses now spoke of preservation, of marking the building as a piece of town history. The sound of spontaneous applause startled her. It started with Tom Wilson and spread quickly, filling the old rafters with a thunderous appreciation for the hero finally welcomed home. Henry ducked his head, overwhelmed by the recognition he'd craved for so long. As the gathering began to disperse, promises of help and visits filling the air, Melody knelt beside Henry's chair. His smile was weak, but genuine, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "This is more than I ever hoped for." Axel hugged the old soldier carefully. "See? I told you people would understand once they knew the truth." Melody watched Henry's face, seeing both peace and lingering sadness there. The town's acceptance was a balm to his wounded spirit. But they all knew one vital piece was missing. Margaret's forgiveness, the one thing that could truly make his homecoming complete, still hung just out of reach. Looking at Henry's tired but hopeful expression, Melody silently renewed her determination. Somehow, she would find a way to bridge the final gap, to help Margaret see past her pain to the truth of Henry's devotion. The stack of unopened letters still waited, holding words of love that had never reached their intended heart. As the last rays of sunset painted the cabin's walls in gold, Melody saw the future taking shape. Not just a house restored, but a family's honor reclaimed, a community's conscience awakened. Now, if only the final wound could be healed before time ran out. Henry sat quietly in his chair, Ranger's head resting on his knee, watching the townspeople's departing figures through the window. His weak smile spoke volumes, gratitude for this measure of peace, but longing for the one voice still silent, the one forgiveness that mattered most. The autumn morning dawned crisp and bright as Melody drove to the nursing home one last time. Her heart pounded as she helped Margaret into the car, the elderly woman's lips pressed into a thin, resistant line. "I don't see the point," Margaret muttered, her hands twisting in her lap. 70 years is too long." Axel, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. "Please give him a chance," he pleaded. "He needs you to know the truth." At the cabin, now swept clean and warmed by a crackling fire, Henry sat in an armchair by the window. His weathered hands trembled as Margaret entered, her steps hesitant. The silence stretched like a thread about to break. Then Axel took Margaret's hand, his small fingers gentle against her papery skin. "He wrote to you every week," he said softly, his voice full of childlike certainty. He never stopped loving you." Margaret's resistance crumbled. Tears spilled down her lined face as she stumbled forward. Henry reached out, and their hands clasped, 7 decades of misunderstanding bridged in a single touch. "I thought you left us," Margaret whispered. "Never," Henry answered, his voice breaking. "Every day, I tried to come home to you." They spent hours together, reading the unopened letters, sharing memories of their lost child, healing wounds that had festered for too long. The community watched in quiet joy as 2 hearts finally found peace. 3 days later, Henry slipped away in his sleep, Ranger lying faithful beside his bed until the end. His face wore a gentle smile, as if his final dreams had been sweet ones. The town came together, transforming the once shunned cabin into a testament to love and courage. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new shingles secured the roof, and flowers bloomed in gardens where weeds once grew. Margaret visited often, sharing stories of the young soldier she'd married, ensuring his memory would live on. Melody and Axel made the cabin their permanent home, welcomed by neighbors who had once warned them away. The rooms echoed with laughter where silence had reigned. On a warm spring morning, Melody and Axel sat on the restored porch, sharing breakfast as sunlight poured over them. Ranger dozed contentedly at their feet, his watchful days finally at peace. Axel's giggles rang out across the yard, as Melody told him stories about the brave soldier who had found his way home. The cabin glowed with new life, its dark history transformed into a legacy of forgiveness and family. What was once abandoned now stood as a beacon of hope, proving that it's never too late for love to heal what time has broken. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story written gently for the heart.